Hey everybody, this is a chapter from a book titled uh, James Burnham and the Struggle for the World, A Life by Daniel Kelly. I'm not going to read this whole book. I'm not particularly, you know, interested in knowing about James Burnham's, life after he becomes a conservative. But I do want to know about his time as a leftist and as a member of the American Trotskyist movement, and also about the managerial revolution. I think this topic will just be about his initial involvement in the Trotskyist Party. There looks like there's about 3 chapters in this book that deal directly with his time as a socialist. So this chapter is chapter 3 of the book, and it's titled Bolshevik. Let's see. Oh, skip too far ahead. The American Workers' Party was founded by a group of militant labor leaders, among them Jerry Allard of the Illinois Progressive Mine Workers Union, J.B.S. Hardman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, and Louis F. Boudinot, aided by leftist but anti-communist intellectuals such as Sidney Hook. At the head of the party was A.J. Muste, a Dutch-born former clergyman who, under the shock of World War I, had turned pacifist and given up his ministry for labor organizing. After winning Muste's spurs in the bitter Lawrence, Massachusetts textile workers' strike of 1919, A.J. Muste had founded the Brookwood Labor College in Katona, New York, to train professional labor leaders. At first, the college enjoyed the support of the mainstream labor movement, but in 1928 the AFL turned hostile to Muste, accusing Muste of organizing pro-Soviet demonstrations and attacking religion, and a few years later had him removed from Brookwood's board of directors. Meanwhile, in 1929, Muste launched a new venture, the Conference for Progressive Labor Action, the CPLA, whose aim was to unionize mass production workers, fight union corruption, and establish a political party akin to Britain's Labour Party. Footnote. Now, give me a second because I got to find the footnote. Let's see. Okay. I think I said this was chapter 3. Come on. We'll get there eventually, kids. God damn it. Okay, sorry about that. That bit is from A.J. Muste, Sketches of an Autobiography. Sorry about that. With the onset of the Depression, Muste moved sharply to the left, dropping the model of moderate British-style Workers' Party. Muste now called for an American Radical Party that, unlike the merely reformist U.S. Socialist Party, would fight for full-scale social revolution, and unlike the U.S. Communist Party, which was genuinely revolutionary but obedient to Moscow, A.J. Muste, quote, but obedient to Moscow, be, quote, rooted in American soil, end quote, and concerned with, quote, American conditions and problems, end quote. To this end, A.J. Muste founded the American Workers' Party. Footnote, A.J. Muste, article, An American Revolutionary Party, published in Modern Monthly, 1934. Hook, who was on the American Workers' Party's organizing committee and busy dissuading Burnham from joining the Communists, cited the American Workers' Party as a better alternative. Burnham was ready to bite, but what landed Burnham was meeting another member of the organizing committee, Jerry Allard, charismatic labor leader and editor of the newspaper Fighting Miner. Burnham was dazzled by Allard, whose commitment to revolution was equaled only by his hostility to the Communist Party, and who seemed a living embodiment of working-class militancy. Footnote, see Hook, Out of Step. The American Workers' Party was formally established by the Committee for Progressive Labor Action in November 1933 at a convention in the grimy factory town of Pittsburgh. Muste was named party chairman, Hardman vice chairman, and Boudinot executive secretary. The party platform's foreign affairs plank was written by Burnham, who borrowed heavily from Lenin. Should the capitalists start a war, this provision declared, the American Workers' Party would act to turn the conflict into a workers' revolt against the war makers. Similarly, if the USSR came under capitalist attack, the American Workers' Party would come to its defense by joining with the workers to overthrow the U.S. government. But Burnham also criticized the Soviet policy of, quote, socialism in one country, charging it with abandoning the principle of, quote, proletarian internationalism and the goal of world revolution. Footnote, Memorandum on the International Position of the American Workers' Party. The American Workers' Party began with a discouragingly modest base. Only about 1,000 people paid dues to the new party, and 1,000 more extended their moral support. Footnote, see Constant Ashton Myers, The Prophet's Army, Trotskyism in America, 1928 to 1941. And footnote. But if this tiny phalanx of left-wing militants garrisoned in a shabby office on Manhattan's 19th Street could not boast of its size, it could point with pride to its zeal and an explosion of hectic activity. Burning with energy, Burnham threw himself into the bustle, writing, traveling, and organizing and handling Muste correspondence when the chairman went to Ohio to help lead a strike. Moreover, with Sidney Hook, he did much to set the party's ideological tone, hewing to a strict Marxist line in everything but aesthetics. Footnote. Sidney Hook to Paul Berman, 24th of April, 1973. Showing the same earnestness as he had in editing the symposium, he worked hard to bring the American Workers' Party message to the world. Thus, after losing a bet to Lucius Wilmerding, he refused to pay Wilmerding in cash, but instead gave him a subscription to the American Workers' Party's paper, Labor Action. Footnote, Wilmerding to author, March 12, 1992. Burnham's most visible American Workers' Party activity was a column he wrote for Labor Action, debuting in March 1934 and called, quote, Their Government. The column concentrated on, quote, exposing the New Deal, which it portrayed in conventional Marxist fashion as a capitalist bailout operation poorly concealed behind a phony show of sympathy for the laboring masses. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was probably the smartest politician ever to sit in the White House, Burnham wrote. Never before had a president so successfully feigned concern for the common man. Yet FDR was in fact working for big business, the banks, the rich, and the munitions makers. FDR was even arming for war, quote, to protect and increase, end quote, capitalist profits and to win new opportunities for capitalism. Both major parties were run by the industrialists and the bankers, Burnham charged, and differed only in their tactics for maintaining the, quote, capitalist dictatorship. Holding elections under capitalism was like permitting prisoners every few years to elect their warden. One warden might be a bit more easygoing than another, but whoever won, prison life would remain largely the same. True democratic government would consist of, quote, political councils based on workers in the shops and fields and mines, and responsible to the workers, end quote, i.e. Soviets. The workers would make real rather than illusory gains only when they seized everything owed them. Footnote, James Burnham, Their Government, published in Labor Action, 1934. The appearance of Their Government, the article, completed a key transition in Burnham's life. The non-political critic had turned into a political activist and columnist. This change was accompanied by a change in his writing style. Since his new readers might not have had much education, he worked himself free of his, quote, pedantry and, quote, highbrowism, and developed a sharper, more direct style and a knack for punchlines. His writing eschewed erudition and grew in energy and impact. New section. Burnham also continued to teach a full load of courses. Divided between wholly separate callings, Burnham's life took on a schizophrenic quality. Aquinas, Dante, the Renaissance, and aesthetics remained his daily fare in the classroom, but when Burnham rolled a sheet of paper into his typewriter, it was to expose the falseness of New Deal social policy or the crooked capitalist system. Only once in 1934 did Burnham's classroom and political lives overlap when he gave a course called The Philosophies of Communism and Fascism. Burnham students found it hard to relate the classroom Burnham to the radical Burnham. One student, his image of Burnham, entirely shaped by an aesthetics class, was amazed to come upon his reserved and seemingly non-political professor haranguing a crowd of demonstrators on the steps of the Arts and Sciences building. Footnote, Jacobs to author, December 27, 1990. Selden to author, November 28, 1990. But despite his Marxism, Burnham could still praise non-Marxist writers, especially when their ideas appealed to his Augustinian sensibility. Foremost among these was the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, whose doubts about the possibility of social progress he readily echoed. Niebuhr took his view of man from Machiavelli. Burnham noted in a 1934 review of Niebuhr's book, Reflections on the End of an Era. Niebuhr knew that human nature, quote, with its dark springs, and, quote, ruled out any chance that social justice would triumph in history, and in his grasp of the human condition so far surpassed most social critics that he was, quote, always worth reading, end quote. James Burnham, Footnote, James Burnham, Religion and Pessimism, Review of Reflections on the End of an Era by Reinhold Niebuhr, The Nation, July 11, 1934. The belief that tragedy always had and always would cast a pall over human existence had long been a basic component of Burnham's own worldview. Ironically, this belief did not sit well with Marxism, which prophesied the salvation of man through revolution. When Burnham embarked on the path of political activism, Burnham gave up editing his literary quarterly. Early in 1934, after its 12th issue had come out, the symposium ceased publication. The ostensible reason was lack of money. Dean Munn moved to Harvard, having dried up its funding. Burnham and Wheelwright could, of course, have looked for money elsewhere, but they did not. Burnham may have decided that his duty now lay in working for revolution. Wheelwright, whose interests had not changed, might have tried to save the magazine had his old relationship with Burnham remained intact. But Burnham was no longer the man he had been 4 years earlier. Not only had he fallen head over heels for Marxism, Burnham was also spending more time with Hooke, who had taken Wheelwright's place as the main influence on Burnham's thinking. This opened up a gap between Wheelwright and Burnham, one which widened in March 1934 when Burnham married (a step Hook thought might have caused the gap to begin with). Footnote: Jacobs to author, December 27, 1990, Hook Oral Reminiscences, and Out of Step. End footnote. When Hook was appointed chairman of the philosophy department, Wheelwright decided it was time to leave, and so he walked away, allowing the journal to expire. New section. Burnham's bride was Marcia Leitner, 22 at the time, and the oldest of three daughters of Frank and Helen Leitner of St. Paul, Minnesota. Footnote: on the Leitner family in the early years of Marcia Leitner, Burnham, to author, June 18, 1992, Kathleen Leitner to author, February 20, 1993, and May 25, 1993, June Boisonis to author, June 3, 1993. Frank Leitner had grown up in Detroit and graduated from the University of Michigan. Going into the dry goods business, he had risen to become an executive at the St. Paul firm of Strong and Warner. In St. Paul, he met his wife, Helen Dean, who came from a local family. The Deans were Presbyterians, and the Leitner children were raised as such. As an Episcopalian, his father was a priest, Frank Leitner nevertheless sometimes escorted his family to church on Sundays, protecting his orthodoxy by dozing off during the sermon. As this suggests, Presbyterian spirituality does not seem to have influenced his behavior, for when Prohibition was enacted, he installed a roomy liquor cache accessible through a trap door under the living room floor of his big house on Grand Avenue. Though enjoying good health all his life, he died before his daughters had grown up, succumbing to pneumonia in April 1928 at the age of 59. Tall, blind, and high-spirited, Marcia was 16 when her father died, and a junior at the Master's School, a boarding school for girls in Dobbs Ferry, New York. Upon graduating a year later, Marcia Leitner persuaded her mother, left with money from her husband, but in anguish over his death, to take the family to Paris for an extended stay. In September 1929, Miss Leitner and her three girls sailed for France, where they boarded at the home of a French family in Auteuil, just outside Paris. While her younger sisters went to the American school in Auteuil, Marcia studied painting at an atelier in the Place des Vosges. Marcia Leitner also developed a liking for nightclubs and once attended a performance by Josephine Baker, then in the first flush of her celebrity. But the Leitners did not stagnate. In February 1930, Miss Leitner took Marcia to London to see a much-publicized art exhibit, and the following summer the whole family went touring. Not until autumn did they head back to St. Paul. Marcia had many interests: music, Marcia played the piano well, and painting among them, but at this point no real plans. The thought of college held little appeal, but neither did Marcia Leitner want to vegetate in St. Paul. Headstrong and, as her sister Kathleen put it, liking to do, quote, flamboyant things, in September 1933, at the age of 21, she moved to New York, and there, despite the Depression, landed a job as a kitchenware, quote, demonstrator in Stern's department store. Soon afterward, Marcia met James Burnham, probably through Burnham's Princeton friend Dean Clark, who happened to be her first cousin. Jim and Marcia's lives had many parallels. Both were Midwesterners with close ties to St. Paul. Both were the oldest of three children of the same sex, had gone east to boarding school, and had lost their fathers in 1928 to pneumonia. Both played the piano, loved good music, and had a strong interest in painting. Both were tall and slim, took pains with their dress, and projected an aura of quiet elegance. (Jim showed great interest in Marcia's wardrobe, Years later, friends remember he liked to talk with her about her clothes, asking, for example, why she had chosen to wear one dress rather than another on a given occasion. Priscilla Buckley to author, footnote, Priscilla Buckley to author, March 31st, 1992, end footnote. Though in temperament they diverged sharply, she animated and expressive, he cool and reserved, each seemed to delight in the other's distinguishing traits. He in her spontaneity, and she in his intelligence and range of knowledge. True, she disliked his political views, but not enough to drop him. After knowing each other a mere 2 or 3 months, they decided to marry. Marcia broke the news to her family in December 1933 when she returned to St. Paul for Christmas. Her mother was far from pleased. Quote, much fuss about Marcia and this Jim Burnham, end quote. Marcia's sister, Catherine, wrote in her diary, outwardly, Miss Leitner opposed the marriage on the ground that Marcia was not yet ready. Inwardly, she may have feared the loss of a daughter who had been a key source of emotional support since her husband's death. On New Year's Eve, she felt ill and had to be hospitalized, perhaps partly because of this new worry. Footnote, Leitner to author, February 20th, 1993. But there was no stopping the determined Marcia. By mid-February, she had completed her wedding arrangements. Miss Leitner had meanwhile thrown in the towel. On the 31st of March, 1934, during NYU's spring break, Jim and Marcia were married in the Leitner's living room, a Presbyterian minister officiating. Notably absent was Burnham's mother, even though at the time she was visiting in St. Paul. She, too, disapproved of the marriage. Possibly, a cousin speculates, because, like Mrs. Leitner, she disliked losing her child, but perhaps also because she opposed the Protestant service. Parenthesis, though she herself had married a Protestant, the wedding seemed to have been performed by a Catholic priest, and the groom had promised that their children would be raised as Catholics. Right after the wedding, the newlyweds dashed back to New York, since Jim's teaching schedule left no time for a honeymoon. Their first apartment was in Greenwich Village, several blocks west of Washington Square. Along with the usual furnishings was an upright piano on which they played duets, often Schubert pieces. Though their courtship had been brief, their marriage proved long and solid. After breaking up with Martha Dodd, Jim had told Sidney Schiff that of the various relationships he would form in the course of his life, he hoped that the one with his wife would be the most important, and so it was. New section. In the years of his marriage, Burnham became involved in another relationship that marked him for life. In 1934, he helped to negotiate a merger between the American Workers' Party and the Communist League of America, which led to his becoming a top lieutenant of Leon Trotsky. At the head of the Communist League of America stood James Patrick Cannon. In 1934, a man in his mid-40s whose blunt features, stocky build, and florid complexion made him look more like a New York police sergeant than a Bolshevik revolutionary. Raised in a Kansas farming community by Irish-American, fiercely socialist parents, Cannon had in his youth joined both the Syndicalist Industrial Workers of the World, for which he had worked at the dangerous job of itinerant organizer, and the Socialist Party, enlisting in its radical wing. But under the spell of the Russian Revolution, and impatient with the Socialist Party's gradualism, Cannon had resigned in 1919 and helped to found the Socialist Party's more militant communist rival. As a Communist Party leader, James P. Cannon had gone to Moscow in 1928 to serve on the program committee of the Sixth Congress of the Communist International, Comintern, the Soviet-run World Organization of Communist Parties, and there his lifelong Trotskyism had begun. Let me repeat that. As a Communist Party leader, James P. Cannon had gone to Moscow in 1928 to serve on the program committee of the Sixth Congress of the Communist International, Comintern, the Soviet-run World Organization of Communist Parties, and there James P. Cannon's lifelong Trotskyism had begun. Leon Trotsky, in 1928, seemed a man in ruin. He had been stripped of all his state and party posts, even of his party membership, and banished to Alma-Ata, the remote and primitive capital of Soviet Kazakhstan. But followers somehow smuggled his criticisms of the Comintern draft into the Congress, criticisms that amounted to an indictment of Communist Party General Secretary Joseph Stalin. Cannon, who studied the criticisms, was at once won over. Quote, "It was clear as daylight," end quote. Cannon said, quote, "that Marxist truth was on the side of Trotsky," end quote. Back in New York, Cannon publicized Trotsky's anti-Stalin views. Almost at once, Cannon was joined by a handful of like-minded militants, foremost among them a party comrade named Max Shachtman. Born in Russia in 1904 and brought to the United States as a baby, Max Shachtman had grown up in the Bronx in relative comfort. As a teenager, Shachtman had joined the Communist Party, and after a year at City College had dropped out to work as a full-time revolutionary. Footnote: see Wald, The New York Intellectuals, and Irving Howe, A Margin of Hope, an Intellectual Biography. End footnote. In superficial ways, Shachtman and Cannon stood poles apart. While Cannon could be ponderous, Shachtman had the nimble, rapid-fire wit of a Borscht-Belt spritzer. Cannon loved, quote, organizational work. Shachtman found it tedious. But the two were at one in their commitment to the Bolshevik cause, whose truest spokesman since Lenin's death, they agreed, was Trotsky. Angered by the Trotskyism of the Cannon Group, in October 1928, the Communist Party expelled it. Undaunted, the Trotskyists at once started publishing a newspaper, The Militant, and laying the groundwork for a political organization. In May 1929, delegates representing a grand total of about 100 Trotskyists nationwide met in Chicago to launch the, quote, Communist League of America, left opposition of the Communist Party, end quote, a name meant to identify the CLA not as a new party in competition with the Communist Party, but as an opposition caucus within the party. That way, said Cannon, it would be easier to win new members from among the Stalinists, a tactic he was counting on to build up his tiny band. I don't know when this is said about Cannon, but this is the policy of just international left opposition in general in the early 1930s. In the early 1930s was as an opposition in the Communist Party that was hoping for readmittance and the reform of the Soviet Union. It wasn't until 1933 that Trotsky decided that being a party just in opposition was impossible, and thus decided that it was necessary to strike out thoroughly on their own and work towards building a fourth international. So at this point, it doesn't seem like it's just like a trick. I don't know. Maybe someone people in mind, it wasn't like a trick to get people over to Trotskyism within the communist camp. I mean, that might have been like a goal, obviously, but also it seems more likely that what was I gonna say? Seems like based on what I know, is that they were actually trying to be part of the mainstream communist movement. Anyway, The ultimate aim of the CLA, Ken Riley declared, was, quote, to take power in the United States, end quote. But its means were virtually nil. Close to flat broke, not until its second year could it scrape together enough money to rent seedy quarters on Manhattan's Third Avenue. The appearance of the Militant was always in doubt, for the paper was printed on a second-hand linotype machine that broke down often. Matching the party's poverty was the personal poverty of many of its members. One, an immigrant house painter from Denmark named Arne Swabek, had so little money that one day at the office he fainted from hunger. To make things worse, the CLA failed to draw recruits from the Communist Party or any other source. Quote, we had no friends, no sympathizers, no periphery around our movement, end quote, Cannon later wrote. Quote, we were utterly isolated, forced in upon ourselves, end quote. Trotskyism languished in obscurity, quote, an isolated handful against the world, end quote. Footnote. Cannon, The History of American Trotskyism, and Cannon, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. Now and then, shrouded in Celtic melancholy, Cannon would vanish to drown his sorrows in drink, his comrades suspected, and not show up again for weeks. Cannon nevertheless regarded himself as a natural leader. Quote, Max, he would tell Shachtman, quote, you either got it or you ain't got it, end quote, and many of his comrades agreed that he indeed had it. Not least among his talents was a gift for rousing oratory. His booming jeremiads against capitalists and Stalinists could bring audiences to their feet, but unlike many in the movement, Cannon was no intellectual. Cannon had had little schooling and was not much of a reader, though he did like light verse and enjoyed reciting poetry, Cannon's lack of aptitude for dialectical fencing made Cannon self-conscious, and to save face, Cannon played the bluff man of action who, while respecting, quote, the serious intellectual, end quote, disdained chattering theorizers. As far as Cannon was concerned, there was no need to theorize. Trotsky had already done so, and the proper work of his followers was to serve as the, quote, old man's messengers. Trotsky charged that the Russian Revolution had been, quote, betrayed. A greedy and power-hungry bureaucracy, the product of Russia's social and cultural backwardness and the economic collapse brought on by the Russian Civil War, had seized control and was waxing fat in a poverty-stricken society. Stalin had risen to power as the bureaucracy's champion, and now, though seemingly a dictator, was really its frontman. Ultimately, Trotsky asserted the revolution's decay stemmed from its failure to take root outside the USSR. For without the aid of more advanced economies, Russia could do little to further its own development. The solution lay in rejecting Stalin's policy of socialism in one country, returning to Lenin's policy of world revolution. Still, true Marxist-Leninists need not despair over the USSR, since the Soviet regime, despite the Soviet regime's perversion, had built a collectivist economy, thus laying the basis for socialism. Accordingly, the USSR, though, quote, deformed, remained a worker state. The revolution had been, quote, betrayed by the ruling stratum, end quote, but not yet overthrown, end quote. Trotsky. These pronouncements of Trotsky's James P. Cannon took as gospel. As far as Cannon was concerned, they were all the theory he needed. They were all the theory that any good Bolshevik needed. New section. In exile since 1929, Trotsky strove to pry the communist movement out of Stalin's grip and make it again the spearhead of world revolution. At first, Trotsky hoped to do this by leaving his disciples in the world's communist parties as, quote, opposition factions that might one day take those parties over, hence the original self-conception of Cannon's CLA. but in 1933, having failed to make headway, he decided that the Stalinists had grown too rotten to be reinvigorated, and that his followers must therefore form parties of their own, along with a new international body to compete with the Comintern. He also now thought that instead of seeking to recruit new members from the communist parties, Trotskyists should focus their efforts on socialist parties, whose more radical members they might be able to attract. If successful, they could increase their own numbers while simultaneously destroying the cohesion of their reformist rivals. Come on, computer. This new tactic was first attempted in France, where in 1934, the 100 or so members of a French Trotskyist group called the Communist League of France carried out a, quote, turn into the French Socialist Party, hoping to win its militants to their banner. Taking his cue from the, quote, French turn, Cannon decided to launch a similar maneuver in the United States as his target Taking his cue from the, quote, French turn, Cannon decided to launch a similar maneuver in the United States. As his target, he picked the fledgling American Workers' Party, which Cannon described as, quote, a political menagerie, which had within it every type of political species, ... from proletarian revolutionists to reactionary scoundrels and fakers, end quote. Cannon. In January 1934, Cannon went into action inviting the, quote, Mustites to meet with the Communist League of America to discuss a merger. The American Workers' Party gave the invitation a mixed reception. Wary of the Trotskyists whom they considered totalitarians, JBS Hardman and Louis Boudin's opposed a merger. Muste was not sure. Hooke had doubts at first, but then turned in favor, hoping for, quote, a strong and active anti-Stalinist force on the left, end quote. Hooke. Burnham supported a merger from the start. Already a Trotsky enthusiast, Burnham had written to the old man, as Trotskyists called their leader, just before the symposium's demise, inviting Trotsky to contribute an article to the journal. Joining forces with serious revolutionary Marxists, he believed, would foster a needed hardening of the American Workers' Party. Quote, fundamentally, he told Hooke, quote, there is the question of whether or not the American Workers' Party is going to be a revolutionary party or a confused bunch of labor agitators, reformists, good fellows, etc., end quote. Therefore, steps should be taken to promote a merger, quote, joint membership meetings, joint meetings of the national committees every 2 weeks, ... exchange of writers in the respective organs, inter-party bulletins, ... end quote. But for all his zeal, Burnham did a poor job of defending his cause. Too confident of the power of pure logic, Burnham ignored the emotional aspect of the art of persuasion. Burnham's audiences seemed to have found him condescending. Every time Burnham spoke on behalf of a merger, said Hooke, quote, we lost support because of his unpersuasive, though very logical presentation, end quote. Must's friends jeered at Burnham for having no contact with real workers. Hardman, in particular, disliked him and accused him of being dogmatic and inflexible. Burnham, equally combative, fought back, attacking Hardman as a, quote, non-revolutionist, and demanding, though not to no avail, that he be dropped from the committee named to take hold with the Communist League of America. Weighed down by the burdens of teaching and politics, Burnham longed to escape. In the summer of 1934, he succeeded at least in at least part of the time by renting a house in New Milford, not far from Canterbury. He spent 3 days a week in the city. He wrote to Hooke, quote, and the other four in the country reading Aristotle and Aquinas and getting sunshine. Their close golden reasoning is relief to the spirit after many American Workers' Party meetings, I remember, and the sunrise is certainly fine for the body, end quote. Burnham. That autumn, the merger talks went into high gear, with Burnham and Hooke and the American Workers' Party most avid negotiators. In November 1934, after almost a year of bargaining, the American Workers' Party finally agreed to merge. Not only had the Trotskyists yielded on certain points of doctrine, under the leadership of Cannon's truck driver friend Vincent Dunn, Trotskyist boss of the Teamsters Minneapolis local, they had also led a long and violent strike in Minneapolis, thus proving that they too were genuinely serious about the labor movement, not simply about the Trotsky-Stalin conflict. Moreover, the American Workers' Party had not made nearly the splash that Muste had hoped for. A merger, he came to think, might revive his flagging venture. Meanwhile, Trotsky had approved the concessions Cannon had made. On December 1st and 2nd, 1934, delegates of the American Workers' Party and the CLA met at the Stuyvesant Casino in downtown Manhattan to seal the bargain. The party that emerged was dubbed the Workers' Party of the United States, WPUS. Cannon was given the post of national chairman and remained editor of the Militant, now renamed the New Militant, while Muste was named national secretary. Hardman and Boudin's, unreconciled to the merger, broke with Muste and went their separate ways. More surprising was a decision by Hooke not to stay active, on the excuse that he needed time for writing, Burnham, viewed by Hooke as the person most eager for the merger, joined Shachtman as co-editor of the New International, a monthly, quote, theoretical journal Shachtman had started a few months earlier. There, Burnham wrote under the name John West, chosen, he once said, to express his hope that, quote, a new Western Renaissance, end quote, lay ahead. The merger turned into a conquest for the Trotskyists, who, far more aggressive than their Mustite partners, quickly took over the Workers' Party U.S. Quote, in one operation, end quote, crowed Cannon, quote, we cleared a centrist obstacle from the path and enlarged our own forces, end quote. Or as Hooke succinctly put it, quote, the Trotskyists swallowed the American Workers' Party, end quote. Not surprisingly, Muste began to regret the merger. Burnham did not. Captivated by the drive and toughness of his new comrades and feeling no nostalgia for the American Workers' Party, Burnham went over to Cannon. New section. Burnham labored mightily for the Trotskyist cause, making his typewriter his major weapon in the struggle, not only as co-editor of the New International, but also as a contributor to the New Militant. As a writer, he stood somewhat apart from the Trotskyist mainstream, favoring a non-rhetorical style over bombast and analysis over denunciation. Although he did not always succeed in avoiding Marxist jargon, he continued to make the New Deal his primary target, but he also trained his guns on Stalinism, calling Stalinism a policy of tyranny at home and collaboration with the, quote, imperialist powers abroad in order to consolidate the dominance of the Soviet bureaucracy. The USSR was nevertheless still a worker state, Burnham affirmed, echoing Trotsky, and hence a country all Marxist-Leninists had to defend, not of course by supporting Stalin, but by seeking the victory of genuine Bolshevism, both in the USSR and around the world. Burnham also wrote about Marxism, the theory that lay behind his political analysis. Burnham took great pride in what he saw as its hard-headed view of the world, in contrast to philosophies rooted in, quote, dreams and illusions, end quote. When an erstwhile quasi-Trotskyist, the veteran exile Max Eastman argued in the New International that Marx, despite his aim of doing away with, quote, philosophy, i.e. subjective imagining dressed up as objective truth, in favor of, quote, science. It simply produced another, quote, philosophy. Burnham peremptorily called Eastman on the carpet. What Marx wanted to do away with, he retorted, was philosophy that reasoned deductively from abstract premises. It was through rigorously empirical inquiry that Marx had arrived at his understanding of history and his belief that his thought was, quote, scientific. Burnham showed equal impatience with Marxists who treated what he considered an experimental philosophy as a kind of holy writ. Genuine Marxism, Burnham asserted, was characterized, quote, not by exhaustiveness of scholarship, not by skill in quoting and counter-quoting, or by abstract, quote, logical consistency, end quote, but by, quote, cogency of concrete analyses, the accuracy of specific predictions, and, the practical success of strategy in action, end quote. Burnham. Besides serving as a mainstay of the party press, Burnham carried on a voluminous correspondence with fellow party members, commenting at length on current party doings, on doctrine and tactics, on forecasts of ultimate triumph or tragedy, depending on which faction and which intraparty conflict came out on top. The amount of time and energy he poured into these letters and his absorption in the trivia they contained suggest that he had lost his sense of measure and was hovering on the brink of a full-blown sectarian neurosis. His behavior in June 1935 illustrates his state of mind. With a grueling college year just ended and a chance to relax at hand, he and Marcia drove to North Carolina to visit an aunt of Marcia's and planned to go next to St. Paul and Kenilworth for more vacationing and visiting. But when an emergency meeting of the Workers' Party U.S.'s National Committee, of which Burnham was a member, was suddenly called for the following week, he raced hundreds of miles back to New York, despite his exhaustion, convinced that he, quote, would have to be there, end quote. His health, and Marcia's, fared poorly in this atmosphere of chronic urgency. His physical condition had been, quote, lamentably bad, during the past 6 months, end quote. He wrote that summer to Hooke, whom he counseled, given his own, quote, unpleasant experience, end quote, to get in a, quote, real vacation, end quote, before the fall term began. Hooke did what he could to ease the pressure on Burnham by giving him a convenient teaching schedule, but this was not enough to do much good. Still, Burnham did not succumb to the party completely. When Cannon, in the summer of 1935, urged him to drop, quote, the 2-for-a-nickel business of instructing college students, end quote, and come to work for the party full-time, he turned down the proposal. He did not think it wise to commit himself totally to a cause that might not come to fruition in his lifetime, he explained to an incredulous Cannon. He even accused the Workers' Party U.S. of failing to understand practical politics. Absorbed in ideology and believing that they would ultimately triumph, Trotskyists, he warned, were doing too little to publicize their views. Even true ideas did not triumph automatically. Like the American Workers' Party before it, the Workers' Party U.S. entered the world with great expectations, sure that it would draw a mass following to its cause. Thanks to donations from veteran Muste supporters, the party was able to rent an office in what Cannon called a, quote, grand palace at 5th Avenue and 15th Street, hire a secretary and install a switchboard. For Trotskyist alumni of the 3rd Avenue days, it was like living in a dream. But before long, the happy dreamers were rudely awakened. Again, few recruits showed up, and soon the money ran out, whereupon the secretary left, the switchboard shut down, and the party was evicted. Now an office was found more in keeping with Trotskyist tradition, a loft in a dingy building on East 11th Street. For a while, the new headquarters had a telephone, but the service proved too expensive and had to be canceled. But far from despairing, the ambitious Trotskyists embarked on a new project. Having splintered the American Workers' Party and enticed its more radical members into their ranks, they set out to execute a, quote, French turn into the Socialist Party. Some 20,000 strong, in 1935, the Socialist Party was deeply divided over how to respond to the New Deal and so made inviting prey. To Cannon, it seemed a, quote, centrist mishmash of, quote, headless, helpless party. A, quote, headless, helpless party, end quote. If the Trotskyists joined the Socialist Party for a while, they might be able to capture its left wing and its youth division, the Young People's Socialist League, and take the converts with them when they left. Whether to attempt a French turn first became an issue for formal Workers' Party U.S. debate in June 1935. Against Cannon, with whom Burnham enthusiastically sided, stood Muste and his friends from the American Workers' Party. For 8 days the debate raged. Muste aimed the brunt of his attack on Burnham. He, quote, used all the Hardman stuff, end quote, Burnham told Hook. Quote, professor, quote, Cannon stooge, quote, Thomist, quote, teacher lecturing, etc. Burnham fired back, impressing his listeners by quoting from Shakespeare and the Bible without having to rummage through Bartlett's familiar quotations. The debate ended with the issue unresolved, but Burnham was so exhausted that he now considered a vacation medically necessary. In the months that followed, Burnham fought tirelessly for the French turn. Quote, we are not concerned with the names of things, end quote. Burnham argued in the Workers' Party internal bulletin, a mimeographed sheet for intra-party debate. The Workers' Party U.S. had value only as a means of advancing the revolution, and could be, quote, altered, merged, modified, repaired, or discarded, end quote, whenever a better means came along. Those who disagreed, he had in Lenin-like tones, should be purged. In March 1936, the Workers' Party U.S. voted in favor of the French turn, but the socialist, quote, old guard, the moderates who controlled the party's New York branch, would not permit Trotskyists to join. Then, in May, the moderates broke with the Socialist Party majority and formed a party of their own, the American Labor Party. With the way now clear, the Trotskyists rushed into action, starting talks with the Socialists on the terms under which the latter would admit them. Quote, it was a difficult and sticky job, Cannon wrote. Quote, very disagreeable. But that did not deter us. A Trotskyist will do anything for bracket his and bracket party. Even ... crawl on his belly in the mud, end quote. When the talks bogged down, Hook stepped in, inviting Cannon and the socialist leader, Norman Thomas, to his apartment for further negotiating. Thomas, a centrist, did not think much of Cannon, who returned his dislike. But, with the aid of Hook, the two leaders reached agreement. The Trotskyists could join the Socialist Party, Thomas stipulated, only as individuals, not as a unit. They must swear not to organize a faction within the party and must shut down the New International and the New Militant. Cannon solemnly accepted, and in June 1936, as one Trotskyist, the poet Harry Roskolenko put it, quote, we simply danced like Bolshevik ballerinas into their pink-hued china shop, end quote. Once entry had been achieved, Cannon, ill from overexertion and heavy drinking, went off to California to recover. The remaining Mustites, who had long since had their fill of Trotskyism, resigned. Muste himself, who was in a position to know, described the French turn as a, quote, fake union, parenthesis, as did Burnham, who later called it, quote, 100% phony, end quote, end parenthesis, and turned his back on the Trotskyists. On a trip to Europe later in 1936, is it Muste? Is he talking about Muste right now? I'm not sure who he is. I don't know, I'll just say he. On a trip to Europe later in 1936, he paid a call on Trotsky himself, perhaps hoping to unravel the mystery of the old man's charisma. But soon after, on a visit to Paris, he had a vision, the content of which he did not reveal, in the church of St. Sulpice, and thereupon washed his hands of revolutionary politics. And it's Muste. Burnham thought this decision reflected a failure typical of idealist intellectuals faced with practical political demands. Quote, "You know as well as I do that politics is certain rough but more or less objective laws, and that intellectuals attend to Platonism, parenthesis, i.e. to a belief in unchanging abstractions, and parenthesis, and moralism and moralism about politics tend to get tangled up in those laws," end quote. Burnham once remarked to Hooke, quote, "Muste as a perfect example," end quote. Quote, "Virtuosos of ideology," end quote. "The Trotskyists made a brilliant addition to the Socialist Party," recalled the literary critic Irving Howe, then a YPSL member. But their notion of themselves as the, quote, "vanguard of tomorrow's vanguard" made it all but impossible for them to fuse with any other group, end quote. Genuine fusion, however, had never been their aim. With Cannon absent, Shachtman, Burnham, and the impoverished house painter Arne Swabach took charge of the movement's key New York chapter, intending to maintain it covertly as a disciplined unit despite Cannon's pledge to Thomas. The Trotskyists also found a replacement for the journals they had had to give up, a newspaper called The Socialist Appeal, an authorized Socialist Party publication. It was, quote, "legal under the Cannon-Thomas Pact," but it belonged to a Chicago labor lawyer and independent Trotskyist, Albert Goldman, who quietly agreed to put it at the disposal of Cannon. Thus armed, and calling themselves the Socialist Party's, quote, "appeal caucus," the Trotskyists took up their work of conversion and demolition. New section. Give me 1 second. Okay. During the French Turn period, Burnham, now 30 years old, consolidated his newfound status as a Trotskyist leader. To begin with, Burnham became one of the old man's chief advisors. Burnham's first important exercise of this function was prompted by the work of the American Committee for the Defense of Leon Trotsky, parenthesis, a group of 120 mostly prominent American intellectual and literary figures, among them the critic Edmund Wilson, the novelist James T. Farrell, and Reinhold Niebuhr, in parenthesis, to vindicate Trotsky against the Soviet regime's charges of treason. In March 1937, the committee set up a commission of inquiry in theory to hear and evaluate the testimony of Trotsky and others, but in fact to impugn the charges and mount a counterattack on Stalin. Both the Defense Committee and the Commission of Inquiry were chaired by John Dewey, whose prestige and reputation for honesty were meant to give the proceedings an aura of impartiality. Trotsky, now living just outside Mexico City as a guest of the painter Diego Rivera, was delighted with this large-scale propaganda campaign on his behalf, but he felt uneasy about John Dewey, fearing that the philosopher, who is nearly 80, might doze off during the proceedings, or worse, as a reputed friend of the USSR, exculpate Stalin. In a letter to Trotsky on strategy, Burnham blithely waved away these worries. Dewey was just the right man for the job, he declared with finality. In the same authoritative tone, he went on to address the problem of the inquiry's staging. Trotsky should drop a rumored plan to hold the hearings informally in Rivera's villa, he advised. Rather, to emphasize its gravity, the inquiry should be conducted in a public hall before a large audience of invited reporters and guests. Moreover, Trotsky's suggestion that, quote, 3 or 5 solid, honest workers, end quote, should be seated on the commission ought to be scrubbed, since everything had to be done, quote, in a thoroughly dignified way, end quote. Trotsky did not follow Burnham's advice in all respects, but when the hearings opened, Dewey presided, and there was no sign of any, quote, solid, honest workers, end quote. Burnham also served as a lobbyist for the Trotsky Defense Committee. In October 1936, he went with Shachtman to solicit Norman Thomas's blessing for the committee, and he often spoke around New York on its behalf. How persuasive he was is uncertain, for he apparently not yet shed his previous podium style. Quote, Burnham gave speeches as if he were his students, end quote. The quasi-Trotskyist writer James T. Farrell complained. Burnham also stood out as a writer for the movement. An editor at the Socialist Appeal, Burnham more than ever directed his fire at the Stalinist regime. Quote, we, bracket, bureaucrats, end quote. He summed up its essence, quote, have altogether abandoned the international revolution. We have given up the class struggle. We are liquidating the revolution inside the revolution. We are interested only in the maintenance of our power and privileges, end quote. Stalin's, quote, popular front strategy of collaborating with non-communists in a joint defense against fascism had the same aim, he wrote. Now, with a new war coming, Stalin was signaling prospective allies, imperialist Britain and France, that in exchange for formal alliances with the USSR, the Kremlin would help them to stifle the rebelliousness of their workers. A similar purpose motivated Stalin's terror, he argued. The Soviet boss knew that the bureaucracy's betrayal of the revolution would provoke opposition, and was determined to crush all potential resistance before the approaching war had begun. The defendants in the Moscow trials were innocent. Their false confessions had been wrung out of them by the, quote, psychological terror of months of GPU isolation, preceded by 10 years of capitulation, threats and promises concerning relatives, faint hope for personal salvation, confrontations with co-confessions, ... all of which combined to complete moral disintegration. End quote. James Burnham. The correct revolutionary response to war and terror was not pacifism, Burnham added, for that, quote, subtle and dangerous enemy, end quote, could, quote, suffocate the campaign for peace and freedom in a fog of sentimentality. The right response was what it had always been, ever-mounting class struggle and the fight for world revolution. Hoping to deepen Trotskyist influence among Marxists of different dispensations, in late 1936, Burnham joined with Hooke and others to found the Marxist Quarterly, a journal for Marxist scholarship in politics, philosophy, literature, art, and economics. The Quarterly would avoid doctrinal exegesis. Its maiden issue announced, and in an ecumenical spirit, base its editorial judgments on, quote, evidence and truth, end quote, rather than party loyalty. It would also try to break with the old Marxist habit of ignoring the United States and stress, quote, American history, conditions, and problems, end quote, parenthesis, an aim of Burnham since his American Workers' Party days, end parenthesis. But quarreling among the editors over the Moscow trials broke out, and after its third issue, the journal closed up shop. Burnham was willing to contribute more than words to the movement. Physically tougher than his academic appearance suggested, and a trained boxer, Burnham was also ready to use his fists if needed. Left-wing politics in the 30s was anything but sedate. On one occasion where he was slated to speak at an anti-Nazi demonstration outside Madison Square Garden, it seemed as if fighting would surely break out. Burnham arrived on schedule and gave his speech ready to shift from words to blows, but the threat blew over. At Washington Square College, Burnham served as the official movement leader. Though never bringing politics into class, he took his movement duties with the utmost seriousness, speaking at rallies, publicizing meetings, and doing whatever else he could to advance the cause. Burnham was assisted by Oscar Schoenfeld, the student in despair over Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, who headed, and according to Schoenfeld, was much of the time the only member of the NYU branch of the Spartacus Youth League, the Trotskyist youth organization. Burnham and Schoenfeld got on well. Schoenfeld, who with comrade to the informality called Burnham, quote, Jim, found him unfailingly amiable and not given to intimacy. As Hooke said of Burnham in the 1930s, quote, bracket, he was, and bracket, outwardly polite. That's the way he'd been brought up, end quote. But with, quote, no great warmth, end quote, and, quote, internally quite hard, end quote. Hooke. Yet Burnham once intervened decisively in Schoenfeld's life. When the communist student leader of the NYU volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War, Schoenfeld felt he too must do so. As Trotskyist student leader, he could not let his Stalinist rival outdo him. But when he told Burnham of his plans, he met with an adamantly negative reaction. If Schoenfeld went to Spain, Burnham warned, the Stalinists, tipped off by their American comrades, would be waiting for him and would kill him. But honor demanded that he go. Schoenfeld insisted. Hour after hour the two debated, until at last, unable to match Burnham's skill at argument, Schoenfeld gave in. Quote, James Burnham saved my life, end quote, he later said. New section. As the Trotskyists prepared for the French turn, Burnham's life took a major turn of its own. In March 1936, Marcia gave birth to their first child, a girl who was named after her mother, nicknamed Marcy. Marcy's arrival may have prompted the Burnhams to look for a house outside the city, a retreat from the summer months and college holidays. Returning to Connecticut in the summer of 1937, they soon found a colonial farmhouse in the Housatonic river town of Kent, 80 miles north of New York and in the middle of what Burnham once described as, quote, a rather primitive area of the northwest Connecticut hills, end quote. Kent had changed little since the Civil War. Its thousands or so inhabitants earned a meager living as their ancestors had by farming, growing tobacco, and raising cattle. A somnolent town buried deep in the state's poorest county, Kent was hardly viewed as chic, parenthesis, though Kent later became so, end parenthesis, but its backwater existence made it an alluring haven from urban life. The farmhouse, a white clapboard structure built in about 1760, was set against a gently rising hillside flanked by forests. Though not large, it was divided into 3 floors connected by steep, narrow staircases and contained 8 small and medium-sized rooms. Near the house stood a ramshackle barn that served as a garage and in time would give the Burnhams extra storage space. In the 1990s, old reading notes of Burnham's could still be found scattered on the barn floor. Beyond the driveway ran a brook that fed a small pond, and on several sides at varying distances lay woodland. Other houses stood nearby, but none close enough to be obtrusive. The property's greatest asset was its atmosphere of peaceful solitude. An atmosphere that struck both Burnhams as idyllic. The Burnhams did some interior remodeling over the years and added flower beds and 2 paved terraces outside. Still, the house retained much of its original flavor. Furnishings and decor were simple and even a trifle Spartan, parenthesis, though not rustic, end parenthesis. Given the Burnhams' otherwise urbane taste, some visitors found the spare atmosphere surprising, one going so far as to call it, quote, strangely primitive. But the Burnhams thought their bucolic retreat enchanting. All you had to do was mention Kent, a friend recalled, and they would start raving and spent as much time there as Burnham's New York commitments would allow. New section. Meanwhile, the French term was running into trouble. As the price of their admission to the Socialist Party, the Trotskyists had promised not to form a faction or publish a newspaper, but once admitted they quickly broke both pledges. The Socialist appeal maneuver enabled them, quote, legally to circumvent the newspaper ban, while informal links, including the bulky letters on ideology and tactics they were addicted to sending each other, allowed them to continue functioning as a unit. In late 1936, they moved towards a more formal mode of organization, using as a cover a Socialist Party body called the Revolutionary Socialist Educational Society. the creation of a New York Party leader and non-Trotskyist named Herbert Zamm. Soon the Trotskyists came to occupy a key place in the society. Burnham and Shachtman, for example, gained seats on its board of directors and set out to make it a vehicle for their ends. Such signs of bad faith made moderate socialists angry. One of the latter, Jack Altman, the executive secretary of the party's New York branch and an opponent of admitting the Trotskyists to the Socialist Party, early in 1937 brought charges of misconduct against Burnham, who at a meeting of the society had laced into its moderate wing with immoderate vigor. Altman may also have been reacting against the party program proposed by the Socialist Appeal in December 1936, which denounced the party's pacifism and adherence to the Stalin-inspired Popular Front and demanded that the party become revolutionary, quote, in the full sense. Altman's attack on Burnham failed, but it caused the now nervous Trotskyists to pick up the pace of their recruitment. Thus, they asked the Revolutionary Educational Society's board to call a national meeting of the socialist left wing, planning to use the meeting to tighten their ties with party militants. When the society refused, they acted on their own, announcing a, quote, appeal institute to be held in Chicago on the weekend of February 20th, 1936, and open to, quote, any and all left-wingers in the party, end quote. At the institute, the announcement went on, the problems of the left and party would be thrashed out in order to achieve, quote, complete cooperation, end quote, between the party's left-wing groups, i.e. unification of the left around the Trotskyists, at the annual Socialist Convention scheduled to meet in New York the following month. 150 delegates attended the Appeal Institute. Prominent among them was Burnham, who not only sat on the resolutions committee, but addressed a plenary session, calling upon all real leftists to break with the moderates and join the Trotskyist World Organization, the, quote, Fourth International. Burnham was also elected to a new, quote, National Action Committee, intended as a permanent caucus through which the Trotskyists hoped to further left-wing unification. Often in the spotlight at the Institute, he came home with his leadership status solidly confirmed. As the Socialist Party convention drew near, the moderates geared up to purge the party of Trotskyism. Cannon, fearing that the French turn's days were numbered, but wanting to hang on for a while longer, opted for a tactical retreat. Rushing back from California, he begged Thomas not to expel his comrades and agreed to Thomas's price for staying the axe, a resolution to be passed by the convention banning from the party all factional publications, including the Socialist Appeal, the resolution's intended target. But once having agreed, the slippery Cannon devised a way to escape the resolution's full impact, quote, a system of multi-copied personal letters, end quote, as he put it, that would carry on the Trotskyist paper's unifying function. In the end, Cannon's labors proved unnecessary. Trotsky decided that the French turn had outlived its usefulness. In April 1937, Trotsky told Albert Glotzer, a young Chicagoan who had served as one of his gun-toting Principe bodyguards, that since the trend of world events demanded a, quote, revolutionary policy, the time for the Trotskyists to break with the socialists had come. In a letter of the 15th of June to Cannon, Shachtman, Burnham, and a, quote, comrade Weber, he made this decision official, naming November 7, 1937, the 20th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, as the date by which the break was to be completed. Cannon, for whom Trotsky's every word was law, at once assented. Shachtman, after brief hesitation, also fell into line. But Burnham, believing that the French turn had not yet exhausted its potential, disagreed. Quote, a year in the party is certainly enough to make most comrades awfully sick of it, end quote. He wrote to Glotzer, quote, but I believe that we still have some business to do with in the framework of the Socialist Party, end quote. Burnham, quote, our job was and remains to rally the maximum number of active militants in the Socialist Party around bracket Trotskyism, end quote. Burnham wrote to Cannon on the 15th of June, quote, "We must leave the road open for taking over the party. We have nothing to lose by this, and a possibility, even though a small possibility, for great gain," end quote. Burnham. The current tactic should be to use the moderates' willingness to continue popular front collaboration with the Stalinists as a basis for attacking the socialist center and building a bigger caucus on the left. This effort would be more likely to succeed, he added, if Cannon paid some attention to matters of, quote, tone. The Trotskyist recruitment drive was not aided by Cannon's denunciation of those who fell short of total agreement with him as, quote, scoundrels, bloodhounds, sons of bitches, shysters, miserable and contemptible, end quote. Collaboration should depend on a common outlook on serious issues, not on whether a potential ally is spelled, quote, Bolshevik with a large or small b, or only back the workers of Barcelona instead of backing them, quote, passionately. Burnham also took his case directly to Trotsky. More time was needed to win over socialists, quote, inclined toward us, end quote. Quote, inclined toward us, but not yet solidly won, end quote. Burnham advised the old man. Moreover, there remained, quote, a small off chance, end quote, of gaining control of the party if, however, the Trotskyists had to break with the socialists, then, quote, in leaving the party we must smash it thoroughly. This we cannot do by merely diving off. A dive leaves the springboard unscathed, end quote. But Trotsky's mind was made up. Quote, the decisive steps must be taken in the next months, end quote, he wrote back. Quote, even at the risk that some sympathizers will remain in the Socialist Party, the best of them will come to us later, end quote. Trotsky. His arguments having failed, Burnham loyally joined in preparing the break. In late July, the Trotskyist High Command met in New York to give official endorsement to Trotsky's new line and went on provocatively to resurrect the socialist appeal. The Central Committee of the Socialist Party's New York branch at once struck back, expelling 54 Trotskyists on the 9th of August. In September, the Socialist National Executive Committee suspended all party members linked to the socialist appeal, decreeing that the suspension would become permanent for those who had not left the paper by October 1st and petitioned for readmission to the party. But the Trotskyists did not seek readmission. Their work was done. The French turn proved to be a modest success for the Trotskyists. If they failed to put the Socialist Party out of business, they did carry off several hundred of its more radical members and perhaps a majority of the YPSL, quote, enchanted captives heading straight into the hermetic box of a left-wing sect, end quote, in the words of Irving Howe, himself one of the captives, end parenthesis. With these converts in hand, they at once got to work on their next project, the founding of a party all their own. That's the end of this chapter. Thank you so much for listening.